Today we will focus on effective communication for nurses, which is an important skill at all levels. We'll review various communication models as well as the multiple ways communication occurs. It is imperative for nurses to understand the differences between therapeutic and non-therapeutic communication, as well as the barriers that can lead to misunderstandings and medical errors. Being aware of the many forms communication takes, in addition to what is said, can help nurses alleviate miscommunication factors that threaten clients' safety while developing strategies to overcome other barriers such as cognitive and sensory deficits. We will talk about some strategies that the nurse can use to overcome a variety of communication barriers, such as language barriers between the client and healthcare provider, or lack of cultural competency, understanding of different cultural norms than those to which the nurse may be accustomed. Communication is the transfer of information. It is always occurring, even if the participants are not directly speaking. Information is shared between the sender and receiver through verbal connection, body language, emotions, and the use of technology or other equipment. Effective communication skills are extremely important for the professional nurse, as miscommunication between team members is often cited as a key issue in client safety. Unclear messages and other forms of miscommunication among members of the healthcare team contribute to many medical errors. Nurses are required to share complex messages with a variety of people with various cultural and educational backgrounds, and at times, these messages are emotional by their very nature. Because of this, it's essential for nurses to understand the communication process and the factors involved that can distort sent and received messages. The nurse also needs to be aware of signs that the client is not understanding the message the nurse is sending. Read the PowerPoint notes on this communication model. Read the PowerPoint notes for this communication model. Read the PowerPoint slides for this communication model. And finally, read the PowerPoint notes for the fourth communication model. Now that you've read the notes for the different types of communication models, please note that there are multiple models, but each model has a sender, a receiver, and a message. Feedback allows the sender and receiver to know the message was properly understood. That's why I say, does that make sense? A lot of times when I am lecturing in person, I'm trying to get your feedback to make sure that you understand what I was saying. Therapeutic communication. Communication is a complex process of sending, receiving, and comprehending information being exchanged between two or more people. It is a dynamic and ongoing process that creates a unique experience for the participants. When communication breaks down, the result can be workplace errors and the loss of professional credibility. No good. Communicating effectively is a skill that nurses must develop. We don't expect you to have that naturally. It is a skill. Nurses use communication when providing care to demonstrate caring, establish therapeutic relationships, obtain and deliver information, and assist with changing behavior. Therapeutic communication is foundational to the nurse-client relationship. Effective communication is key to ensuring a client's safety. There are different levels of basic communication. Interpersonal communication is communication within an individual. It is each person's self-talk, the internal discussion when thinking but not outwardly verbalizing thoughts. It helps nurses assess clients and situations and think critically about them before communicating verbally. Interpersonal communication is communication between two people. This form of communication is the most common in nursing and requires an exchange of information with another individual. However, the receiver can perceive a message differently than the sender intended. Public communication is communication to, within, or between large groups of people. Using this type of communication, many nurses teach, give community presentations, or write about nursing or healthcare topics and issues. Small group communication is communication within a group of people, often working towards a mutual goal in committees, research teams, or support groups. Therapeutic communication has functional components, like the referent, which is the incentive or motivation for the communication between two people, the sender, the person who initiates and transmits the message, the receiver, the person to whom the sender aims the message and who interprets the sender's message, then the actual message, the verbal and nonverbal information the sender expresses and intends for the receiver. The channel is the method of transmitting and receiving a message. That could be through sight, hearing, touch, facial expression, or body language. Environment is the emotional and physical climate in which the communication takes place. And feedback can be verbal, nonverbal, positive, or negative. The message the receiver returns to the sender that indicates the receipt of the message. Feedback is an essential component of ongoing communication. Interpersonal variables are factors that influence communication between the sender and receiver, like educational or developmental levels. Methods of communication. We have verbal communication, which is vocabulary. These are the words that communicate a message the sender writes or speaks. Limited vocabulary or a use of a different language can make it difficult for nurses to communicate with clients. Using medical or nursing jargon can decrease clients' understanding. Children and adolescents tend to use words differently than adults do. Credibility is the trustworthiness and reliability of the individual. Nurses must be knowledgeable, consistent, honest, confident, and dependable. A lack of credibility creates a sense of uncertainty for clients. Denotative and connotative meaning. When communicating, participants must share meanings. Words that have multiple meanings can cause miscommunication if people interpret them differently. Clarity and brevity. The shortest, simplest communication is usually the most effective. Long and complex communication can be difficult to understand. Timing and relevance. Knowing when to communicate makes the receiver more attentive to the message. When clients are uncomfortable or distracted, it can be difficult to convey a message. Pacing. The rate of speech can communicate a meaning the speaker did not intend. Speaking rapidly can suggest not having time for the clients. Intonation. The tone of voice can communicate a variety of feelings. Nurses communicate feelings like acceptance, judgment, and dislike through their tone of voice. Nonverbal communication. Nurses should be aware of how they communicate nonverbally and determine the meaning of the client's nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication can often have a greater effect on a message than the words do. Culture can also affect interpretation. Attention to the following in both the communicator and the receiver is necessary. Appearance, posture, and gait. Physical characteristics can convey professionalism. Body language and posture can demonstrate comfort and ease in the situation. The first impression is very important. Facial expressions, eye contact, gestures. Facial expressions can reveal feelings that clients may easily misinterpret. Eye contact typically conveys interest and respect, but varies with culture and situation. Gestures can enhance verbal communication or create their own messages. Sounds. Crying or moaning can have multiple meanings, especially when other nonverbal communication accompanies it. Territoriality, personal space. Lack of awareness of territoriality, the right to space, and personal space, the area around an individual, can make clients perceive a threat and react defensively. Electronic communication. Some facilities permit nurses to communicate with clients via email. An email encryption system is essential for assuring confidentiality. These facilities must also have guidelines that address when and how to use email and what information nurses can convey. Many clients welcome the use of technology in this way. For all clients, nurses must have their permission to communicate electronically and must respect their preferences. Email communication becomes part of the client's medical record. Forms of communication. Communication comes in many forms. Messages can be sent verbally between the sender and receiver, while nonverbal body language adds to the message. What the receiver hears in relation to what the sender says is another aspect of communication. The tone and emotional triggers of what is being said also shape communication effectiveness. Verbal and physical communication in nursing. Both verbal communication, what is said, and nonverbal communication, physical gestures, also known as body language, play important roles in interactions among nurses, clients, and their families. For example, not making eye contact, not being engaged in the conversation, and having closed or poor posture, such as folding arms and slouching, can portray a negative message no matter what is said verbally. Body language can be intentional, but is often an unconscious display of the person's feelings. In situations where there are mixed or confusing messages being sent, the nonverbal or physical messages tend to outweigh what is being said verbally. When attempting to understand nonverbal communication, the nurse must take culture, age, language, physical deficits, and developmental levels into account. As a result, many healthcare providers are encouraged to receive additional training in therapeutic communication to better communicate with clients and each other. Discussing topics with clients using an empathetic tone rather than an impatient or critical one often reduces stress and encourages honesty in disclosures. This doesn't come easy for everyone, and vocal tones or physical cues that seem innocent and innocuous to one person can be offensive to another. Gender, stress level, and various communication styles can all affect how a message is perceived. It is recommended that nurses study interpersonal communication to enhance their communication skills, prevent mistakes through miscommunication, and foster better relationships with clients and team members. Auditory communication is what the receiver hears when the sender speaks a message. Auditory communication includes the speed and tone of voice that the receiver perceives. This can be affected by many factors, such as physical and intellectual disabilities or outside disruptors like noise from medical equipment. If the client does not participate in the discussion, there may be a barrier that prevents the client from hearing the nurse or causes a misunderstanding. Nurses need to be aware of any limitations a client may have with auditory communication and adjust their methods to ensure the correct information is being provided. For instance, when discussing a planned procedure in order to ensure effective client teaching and understanding, the client should be assessed for hearing or cognitive deficits that would prevent understanding. If any are found, alternative tools should be used. Emotional communication refers to the speaker's emotional state when conveying a message. The emotional state can be transferred to the receivers and will affect how the message is accepted. Messages conveyed with negative emotions or a condescending attitude will not be well received by the listeners. For instance, a nurse assessing a client's food diary can convey the message with a tone of either negativity or compassion. Speaking to a client from an empathetic frame of mind will often help build trust and a positive rapport. This is especially true in healthcare when many nurse-client interactions involve difficult conversations that may be hindered by the client's fear or anxiety. An example is discussing imminent end-of-life issues with clients or family members, such as in the case of a pediatric client. Each person will be experiencing different emotions that will enable or hinder communication. A speaker's energetic communication refers to how the person projects themselves. For example, an actor who has a remarkable stage presence and a physician who is perceived as cold and unsympathetic can be viewed differently despite providing the same information. For nurses, maintaining a caring and compassionate attitude and demonstrating empathy when communicating with clients and their families will help their message to be received in a more positive light. Another component of energetic communication involves the actual bioelectric energy that exists in the body and how that energy affects health and communication. Many providers state that a client's emotional state affects health status. This is tied to the effect emotions have on the electrical impulses in the body. There are complementary health techniques such as heart math, which teaches clients the connection between emotions and the electrical communication between the heart and brain to improve health. This technique uses biofeedback through monitoring devices to teach the client how the heart's electrical impulses are affected by positive and negative emotions. According to the research, the heart's activity changes based on emotions and cognitive activities such as thinking of a happy memory. Modes and types of communication. The methods by which people communicate with one another have been altered with the technological changes of the digital age. Face-to-face communication is often replaced with electronic versions via text or video sources. Clients now have options of speaking to a nurse through telecommunication methods rather than physically going to a healthcare facility. This change has resulted in both improved efficiency and additional miscommunication depending on the preferred communication mode of both the sender and receiver. Many age group and cultures value one communication mode over the other, and the nurse must be savvy in all forms to clearly communicate. Modes of communication. There are 4 modes of communication: verbal, nonverbal, electronic, and written. Verbal communication commonly refers to oral communication. This mode can occur through face-to-face communications and via telephone. Members of the baby boomer generation rely mostly on this mode of communication to convey messages. Many healthcare facilities now use client portal health applications and text reminders rather than follow-up telephone calls. Depending on the age, culture, and socioeconomic background of the client, these electronic communication methods may be underused or viewed as lacking a personal connection. In addition, the need to have hands-on communication may cause these receivers to print out emails or request hard copy versions of items. Nonverbal communication is body language. Actions such as eye contact, facial gestures, posture, and overall appearance send messages to the receiver in addition to what the sender is saying. These messages may support or contradict what is being said in the verbal mode of communication. Many people who value face-to-face communication appreciate being able to perceive the nonverbal communication from the speaker because it can provide emotional feedback. Nonverbal cues can also lead to confusion and misunderstandings depending on the sender's competence with face-to-face interactions and the receiver's ability to interpret. An example of a nonverbal communication is the nurse placing the computer on wheels between them and the client as they ask questions. This blocks the ability of the nurse to make eye contact with the client, and the client may perceive this as the nurse not being compassionate or empathetic. Electronic communication. There are many options available to the nurse to use electronic communication. This mode includes email, texting, video conferencing, and social media. This technology can allow healthcare team members to communicate with each other and their clients more efficiently, but can also lead to privacy violations, mistakes from typographic errors, and distractions. The Joint Commission has required the use of secure messaging when transmitting client information to help maintain client confidentiality and reduce HIPAA violations. Prescriptions and other private client information can be texted among providers, but only via a secure service that has safety measures in place to reduce errors. There are many applications available that allow encrypting of information and erasing of patient information if the device is lost or stolen, but this technology is not often in place on personal cellular phones. If encryption or other security measures are not available to ensure private health information is protected, then another secure method must be used. According to the HIPAA security rule, any electronic communication containing PHI must have the following safeguards. Each user must have a personalized login that can be monitored. The system must have an automatic log-off function if left unattended, and personal health information sent as attachments must be indecipherable if intercepted. Written communication includes electronic communication and can be in the form of a letter, handwritten or typed, or an email on computer or computer-based post. These modes of communication lack the nonverbal cues that face-to-face interactions possess, leading some users to view them as detached. This lack of body language and other nonverbal cues can make it difficult for the recipient to determine tone and may lead to misunderstandings even if the sender reports to the use of emoticons, and avatars to represent emotions. Other shortcomings to written communication include the receiver's need to be able to read the words. Literacy, language differences, and visual impairments may all present a barrier to effective written communication. Communication styles. Much like the various forms and modes of communication, the tone and style of communication affect how a message is received and understood. These communication styles include passive, assertive, and aggressive. Some models also include a fourth type referred to as passive-aggressive. The most effective type of communication is assertive due to its cooperative and straightforward style. The other three types tend to take the focus from the message being sent and place it on either the sender or the receiver. This approach can hinder open communication and lead to misunderstandings. Passive communication. Persons who display a passive communication style have developed a pattern to avoid conflict, expressing feelings or opinions, or standing up for themselves when boundaries are crossed. These people are often anxious and fearful in regards to how their message will be perceived, and they will say nothing or respond to an assertive or aggressive style by agreeing. Some novice nurses may demonstrate this communication type when faced with confronting a provider or authority figure due to lack of confidence. An example of a passive communication style would be a nurse stating after a meeting, "I'll do whatever you want." Even if they do not agree with the sender, they may fear going against the person or may lack the knowledge to suggest another option. Assertive communication. Assertive communicators are viewed as most effective because they communicate clearly and honestly. They advocate for their opinions, rights, and needs without violating the rights of others. Assertive communication is fundamental for good communication, mental health, and healthy relationships. These people are confident in their message and assert their rights if boundaries are crossed, but are also fair and receptive. Assertive communicators tend to use more I statements rather than you statements, which are usually associated with blaming. An assertive communicator in the same meeting as a passive communicator above might state the following: "I expressed my ideas clearly, and the others in the meeting chose a different option." Aggressive communication. Aggressive communicators have developed a pattern of expression that is verbally and sometimes physically abusive, such as, "This is all your fault. I will make you pay." These people tend to blame the receiver using you statements. These senders often interpret other speakers, tend to be controlling, and may become antagonistic or even hostile when they are challenged. They are quick to react and often do not take the time to work through misunderstandings. A nurse using an aggressive communication style might tell a new nurse, "It's your fault the client fell. You never listened to me." Passive-aggressive communication. Passive-aggressive communicators appear passive only on the surface. Often the initial is acting out of anger in a subtle, indirect, or secretive way. This behavior stems from feelings of powerlessness and resentment. These senders will use sarcasm or other witty responses. Unlike aggressive communicators, these persons rarely interrupt others, but then feel ostracized from groups when they do not feel heard. A nurse who is a passive-aggressive communicator might ignore a client who has pushed the call light several times or state they will do something and then not follow through. Many factors can influence communication, affecting the sender, receiver, or both. Cognitive, intellectual, or developmental deficits such as dementia, Down syndrome, and the autism spectrum disorder are examples. Physical deficits such as hearing loss, cultural differences, language barriers, and emotional factors like a noisy emergency department can influence one's ability to effectively communicate a message. A client may have several of these factors that influence their ability to effectively communicate. As a result, nurses must develop strategies to overcome these influences in order to ensure positive client outcomes. Psychosocial and physiological factors. Clients' psychosocial and physiological factors, as well as those of the nursing staff, can influence communication effectiveness. Nursing is often faced with a lack of available staff and time constraints. As a result, many nurses try to focus on what they believe to be the most important client care tasks, while other aspects of client care, such as providing emotional support, may be overlooked. An example of this was demonstrated in a study of oncology clients. These clients had financial and spiritual concerns, but due to lack of time to manage their workloads, many nurses were unable to provide the support of communication to these clients and instead focused on the physiological issues such as pain control. Some clients saw this negatively, stating that the nurse did not like them, while other clients felt they were being bothersome if they tried to communicate these other concerns. As a result, the clients did not receive the emotional support they needed for optimal outcomes. Physiological factors such as hearing or vision loss can prevent effective communication as well, especially if the client is not open with this information. If the nurse determines the client has a physical deficit, strategies should be implemented to assist, such as moving a client with hearing impairment to a quieter area or reading to a client with impaired vision. Developmental and cognitive factors. Cognitive, intellectual, or developmental deficits, such as autism spectrum disorder, can greatly influence a person's ability to effectively communicate, particularly in social situations. The number of children diagnosed with ASD continues to rise. These clients tend to be subjected to misunderstandings and unmet needs due to their communication barriers. Clients who have developmental and cognitive factors influencing their communication abilities may be distracted by an environment that is very noisy or bright, more so than clients without these deficits. The nurse working with these clients can enhance communication by giving short, direct instructions that are clear and free from slang, medical terminology, or abstract imagery. Physiologic issues and disease processes can also affect cognitive function, such as poorly controlled chronic pain, Parkinson's disease, and multiple sclerosis. Ultimately, nurses need to understand the way a developmental disorder may present itself and take the time to get to know the communication limitations of their clients to implement the most effective plan of care. Situational and environmental factors. Environmental factors such as excessive noise, extreme temperatures, poor or too bright lighting, and other elements that can make those trying to communicate uncomfortable can hinder the connection between nurse and client and act as a distraction. Outside interferences, such as the use of social media or texting during communication sessions, are determined to be effectively sharing a desired message. In addition, situational issues that cause strong emotions such as fatigue, anxiety, and fear can hinder effective exchange. The nurses who are exhausted from working a double shift, the team that is anxious and overwhelmed during an emergency situation, or the client who is fearful after receiving a disturbing diagnosis will all have situational factors that can affect their communication skills and ability. Cultural and demographic factors may include many influences that can enhance or hinder communication. A client's language, religion, sexual orientation, age, and gender can all affect the way communication occurs. The nurse's cultural competency or biases influence this communication as well. In addition, healthcare itself is affected by institutional racism, resulting in inequitable access to care and minorities being underrepresented among professional caregivers. Sexual orientation may influence communication among healthcare providers and clients. Some clients may fear disclosing this information, especially transgender clients, who research states tend to receive less support due to the health provider's lack of education about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer topics. Again, much of the burden falls to the nurse to increase education and sensitivity to the various factors that can influence communication in order to better prepare and provide the best care possible. Therapeutic communication. Therapeutic communication is an important skill in listening. In this form of communication, nurses use listening skills, empathy, and a desire to build a professional relationship with the client to provide holistic and patient-centered care. Despite the importance of this skill in improving both client and professional relationships, many nursing students state it's one of the most stressful and difficult skills to learn. This belief supports the theory that non-therapeutic communication results in misunderstandings, poor patient care, and decreased patient satisfaction. Therapeutic relationships. Communicating a compassionate, caring, and empathetic attitude towards clients is an expected skill in nursing. These three characteristics are often described as the cornerstones of a therapeutic relationship. Phases of developing relationships. The nurse-client relationship can be defined by four phases, originally identified as orientation, identification, exploitation, and resolution termination. These are important. The orientation phase is the initial phase in which the client reaches out to the nurse or other healthcare provider for help. Identification occurs when the two establish a mutually respectful relationship. Exploitation is the active phase of the relationship where the nurse educates the client to change the situation or behavior. In the final phase, resolution or termination, the client has had the issue resolved and the relationship between the nurse and client is terminated until the next event. Throughout this interaction, the nurse acts as a guide to help the client receive the needed care. Therapeutic communication techniques. There are several techniques that can be used to improve nurse-client communication. Examples include using silence, engaging in active listening, asking open-ended questions, accepting, giving recognition, restating, summarizing, and reflecting. When used correctly, these techniques can help build trust in the nurse-client relationship and encourage open communication. In active listening, the nurse considers both the client's verbal and nonverbal messages to understand the true meaning of the exchange. This technique requires each participant to focus on the speaker rather than planning what the listener will say next. For example, a nurse speaking to a client about an event might use nodding and "I see" comments to convey attention, followed by open-ended questions such as "tell me more about that," to get the client to continue to talk. Asking open-ended questions encourages communication between the nurse and client because it requires more interaction than a simple yes or no answer. This technique is often paired with strategic use of silence to encourage the client to continue speaking. The use of silence gives both the nurse and client a chance to absorb the conversation and determine what should be discussed next. Using silence encourages the client to disclose more information, reduces the physical space between the nurse and client, and focuses on a topic area to learn more. It is recommended the nurse allow the client to choose the topic and be the one to break the silence. For example, a nurse is talking with a client after the loss of a family member. The client states, "I adopted a dog." The nurse could use an open-ended question such as, "And how did that make you feel?" followed by silence to allow the client to discuss their feelings. Restating, paraphrasing, and summarizing all require the nurse to repeat the message back to the client to ensure there was no misunderstanding between the participants. This gives the clients a chance to clarify if the nurse misheard or misunderstood. Active listening and restating are helpful to clarify what has been said. For instance, at the end of the discussion, the nurse could summarize what the client has said and then ask if this is correct. This shows the client the nurse was listening and also allows for the chance to correct any misunderstandings or miscommunications. Reflection is comparable to restating, but instead of repeating the client's message back to them, the nurse attempts to reveal the client's feelings behind the message. Reflection is used most often when clients are asking for advice or the nurse's opinion about a topic. Asking the client, "What do you think you should do?" reflects the topic back to the client and encourages the client to take ownership and accountability for their own lives and actions. Other therapeutic communication techniques a nurse can use include accepting, which is acknowledging that the nurse has heard and understood the client, giving recognition of changes without compliments, which can be seen as bias, and offering to spend time with the client by simply sitting with them. In some instances, the nurse may need to use the technique of focusing to get a client to speak about an important topic that may only be mentioned briefly but is important. In focusing, the nurse uses observations and perceptions to kindly confront or call out doubt for clients who are jumping from topic to topic, communicating something that is unlikely, or the result of a delusion. Overcoming communication barriers. The ability to overcome communication barriers requires the nurse to be skilled in identifying and developing more effective communication strategies. If poor communication continues between the nurse and client, or between the nurse and other members of the healthcare team, medical errors and other poor client outcomes may occur. Communication barriers and strategies to overcome. Language differences, cultural diversities, speech or hearing impairments, developmental or cognitive disorders, and environmental factors can all be communication barriers. In the United States, 1 in 5 homes speaks a language other than English, and for some, this is their only language. As more people move from other countries to the United States, the number continues to grow. Spanish, Mandarin, Cantonese, and Russian are all popular languages in the U.S., but are underrepresented in nurses having the ability to speak them. This communication barrier can lead to misunderstandings between the nurse and client regarding important healthcare decisions. The use of a qualified medical interpreter is a strategy to overcome this communication barrier, and as of the year 2000, is mandated for any healthcare facility that receives federal funding, like Medicare or Medicaid reimbursement. Depending on the facility, this interpreter may be available in person or via telephone. Family members, especially those younger than 18 years, as well as non-professional phone apps, should not be used as medical interpreters. Non-medical persons may not fully understand what the nurse wants to translate to the client and provide information in error. If this person is also a family member, the client may not want the person to know the information being provided, or the translator may change or leave out information to avoid upsetting the client. Finally, translation services on smartphone applications are usually not HIPAA compliant to protect private health information and may be inaccurate. Nurses need to develop cultural competence to overcome cultural differences that may be barriers to communication. Nurses need to develop cultural competence to overcome cultural differences that might be barriers to communication. Learning more about behaviors that are acceptable and unacceptable for the client population commonly cared for can help the nurse better understand the client's actions and avoid misunderstandings. Each culture has beliefs and customs that may be different from that of the nurses, but showing respect and compassion can help overcome these differences. Active listening and other therapeutic communication skills, such as respectful touch when appropriate and helping to relieve suffering, convey this caring attitude. Cognitive and developmental impairments can make it difficult for clients to exchange and understand information. These impairments can be related to another medical condition, such as dementia, stroke, or autism. Adverse effects from medications can cause cognitive deficits for some clients as well. Using uncomplicated words, avoiding medical terms, and speaking clearly at a slower pace may be helpful to communicate with clients who have barriers in any area. Providing a well-lit, supportive environment with limited noise and other distractions can be beneficial. The nurse should be aware of the client's body language to determine if there is more to the message than the client cannot or is choosing not to communicate. Finally, making sure the client can see and hear who is speaking to them is essential. The nurse can facilitate this by facing the client and ensuring any assistive devices, such as hearing aids and eyeglasses, are present and in use. If the impairment is due to prescribed medication for recreational drug use, it may simply be necessary to wait for the effects to fade. Healthcare providers need to communicate effectively and appropriately with clients who have disabilities to ensure the safe and effective delivery of care. First, talk to the client in the same way and with a normal tone of voice. Avoid shouting, including sitting or standing at eye level and making appropriate eye contact. Ask if assistance is needed and take steps to ensure effective communication strategies are used. There are many basic communication enhancing strategies that can be used in most cases, no matter the barrier. Showing respect and empathy, not interrupting, being mindful to exhibit supportive body language, and conveying simple, honest messages can help the nurse deliver needed information. The nurse should ensure that the information is understood by using communication enhancers such as reflecting or summarizing. Therapeutic communication is the purposeful use of communication to build and maintain helping relationships with clients, families, and significant others. Nurses use interactive, purposeful communication skills to elicit and attend to clients' thoughts, feelings, concerns, and needs, express empathy and genuine concern for clients' and families' issues, obtain information and give feedback about client status, intervene to promote functional behavior and effective interpersonal relationships, evaluate clients' progress towards desired goals and outcomes. Children and older adults often require specific age-appropriate techniques to enhance communication. Use of the nursing process depends on therapeutic communication among the nurse, client, family, significant other, and the interprofessional healthcare team. Characteristics of therapeutic communication: client-centered, not social or reciprocal, purposeful, planned, and goal-directed. Essential components include time. Plan for and allow adequate time to communicate with others. Attentive behavior or active listening. Use this as a means of conveying interest, trust, and acceptance. Caring attitude. Show concern and facilitate an emotional connection and support among nurses, clients, families, and significant others. Honesty. Be open, direct, truthful, and sincere. Trust. Demonstrate to clients, families, and significant others that they can rely on nurses without doubt, question, or judgment. Empathy. Convey an objective awareness and understanding of the feelings, emotions, and behaviors of clients, families, and significant others, including trying to envision what it must be like to be in their position. Non-judgmental attitude. A display of acceptance of clients, families, and significant others encourages open, honest communication. The nursing process for therapeutic communication, we have our assessment and data collection. We have to determine verbal and nonverbal communication needs for client-centered care. Clients who have hearing, vision, or cognitive losses are unresponsive, are aphasic, or do not speak the same language as the staff. We have to consider their physical status. We have to consider the developmental level and alter communication accordingly. With children, use simple, straightforward language. Be aware of nonverbal messages because children are especially sensitive to nonverbal communication. Enhance communication by being at the child's eye level. Incorporate play into interactions. Older adult clients. Recognize that many older adults require amplification of sound. Make sure assistive devices, glasses, and hearing aids are available for clients who need them. Minimize distractions and face clients when speaking. Speak in short, simple sentences. Allow plenty of time for clients to respond. Ask for input from caregivers or family to determine the extent of any communication deficits and how best to communicate. Identify any cultural considerations that affect communication. Provide an interpreter. Address the client directly when the interpreter is present. Provide educational materials and instructions in the client's language. For planning, we want to minimize distractions, provide privacy, identify mutually agreed upon outcomes, set priorities according to the client's needs, collaborate with other healthcare professionals when necessary, and plan adequate time for interventions. When we implement therapeutic communication, we want to establish a trusting nurse-client relationship. Clients feel more at ease during implementation phase when nurses establish a helping relationship. We want to provide empathetic responses and explanations by using observations, giving information, conveying hope, and using humor. We want to manipulate the environment to decrease distractions, turn those TVs off. Make sure verbal communication and nonverbal communication are congruent. That means the same. Demonstrate an empathetic presence by appearing relaxed and comfortable, facing the client, having an open posture, leaning toward the client, and maintaining good eye contact unless cultural norms discourage it. Effective skills and techniques for therapeutic communication include silence. This allows time for meaningful reflection. Presenting reality. This helps the client distinguish what is real from what is not and to dispel delusions, hallucinations, and faulty beliefs. Active listening helps the nurse hear, observe, and understand what the client communicates and provide feedback. Asking questions is a way to seek additional information. Open-ended questions facilitate spontaneous responses and interactive discussion. It encourages the client to explore feelings and thoughts and avoids yes or no answers. Clarifying techniques helps the nurse determine whether the message the client received was accurate. Restating uses the client's exact words. Reflection directs the focus back to the client for them to examine their feelings. Paraphrasing restates the client's feelings and thoughts for them to confirm what they have communicated. Exploring allows the nurse to gather more information about important topics the client mentioned. Offering general leads, broad opening statements encourage the client to start and continue talking. Showing acceptance and recognition acknowledges the nurse's interest and non-judgmental attitude. Focusing helps the client concentrate on what is important. Giving information provides factual details that the client might need for decision making. Summarizing emphasizes the important points and reviews what the nurse and the client have discussed. Offering self demonstrates a willingness to spend time with the client. The nurse can share limited personal information, but the focus should return to the client as soon as possible. Relevant self-disclosure by the nurse helps the client see that others share their experience and understand. Touch, if appropriate, touch can communicate caring and provide comfort. And sharing feelings. Ask clients to express feelings and help them identify their feelings. Plan to discuss negative or angry feelings with peers or other support persons rather than the client. The nurse can also share feelings of caring and concern with the client, which can promote rapport with the client. There are also some ineffective skills and techniques that should not be used with therapeutic communication. These could include asking irrelevant or personal questions, offering personal opinions, stereotyping, giving advice, giving false reassurance, minimizing feelings, changing the topic, asking why questions or asking for explanations, challenging, offering value judgments, asking questions excessively and probing excessively, responding approvingly or disapprovingly, being defensive, testing, judging, offering sympathy, arguing, making automatic responses, and reacting with passive or aggressive responses. All those things can inhibit therapeutic communication. Communication among health professionals. Nurses must communicate clearly, respectfully, and professionally with all staff members. Faulty communication among the members of the healthcare team can have a negative effect on the work environment and on clients' outcomes. Incivility is rude dialogue or actions like sarcasm or eye-rolling. Bullying is repeated words or actions of intimidation. And lateral violence is abusive words or actions of peers, gossiping, exclusion of information, threats of harm, and actual harm. In summary, communication is not a linear process, but an ongoing cycle that includes both verbal and nonverbal cues. There are multiple communication models, but each has at minimum a sender, a receiver, and a message. The 4 models of communication discussed were X, Y, and Z. I don't expect you to remember them. Feedback allows the sender and receiver to know the message was properly understood. There are 5 forms of communication: verbal, nonverbal, auditory, emotional, and energetic. There are 4 modes of communication: verbal, nonverbal, electronic, and written. There are 4 types of communication: passive, aggressive, assertive, and passive-aggressive. Multiple factors can be barriers to effective communication, such as cognitive deficits, physical disabilities, and environmental factors. There are 4 phases to the nurse-client relationship: orientation, identification, exploitation, and resolution. Non-therapeutic barriers include not listening to the client, dismissing what the client is saying, attempting to reassure or give advice, or challenging the client or disagreeing with what is being said. Many communication barriers can be overcome with a holistic, patient-centered care approach that provides empathetic support for the client.